She invited her stepsister to the wedding specifically to show everyone what she had become. She had not considered what her stepsister had actually become. The Hartwell wedding reception had been arranged with the precise excellence that results when a woman of considerable social skill applies 6 months of focused attention to a single occasion. The flowers were correct for October. Deep amber chrysanthemums, late roses in burgundy, greenery cut from the estate's own grounds rather than imported and therefore entirely at home in the rooms that held it. The food was the kind that guests remember without being able to say exactly why. Not elaborate, genuinely good. The guest list had been curated with the specific care of someone who understands that the company at a wedding is not merely the audience for the occasion, but is itself the statement the occasion makes. Miss Vivienne Hartwell. Lady Hartwell now, as of 3 hours ago, stood near the east fireplace with a champagne glass she had been carrying for 20 minutes without drinking from, and watched the room with the comprehensive attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. It was not going according to plan. This was not a familiar experience for Vivienne Hartwell. Things generally went according to her plan. She had selected the venue, the flowers, the menu, the guest list, the seating arrangements, and the precise social choreography of the afternoon. With the thorough competence she had applied to every important occasion since she was 16 years old. She had also selected, with the specific deliberateness that distinguished this wedding from every other occasion she had organized, the guest she most wanted to witness it, Miss Clara Fenwick, her stepsister, translator of German philosophy, resident of Edinburgh, unmarried, modestly housed, professionally employed in a field that no one at this reception would consider worth discussing. The woman Vivienne had spent 6 months imagining arriving at this occasion and finally understanding the full distance between what she was and what this was. Clara was not at this moment standing at the edge of the room understanding the full distance. She was standing near the garden doors with the Dowager Lady Hartwell, 87 years old, the family's most formidable member, a woman who had attended 200 social occasions in 60 years and found virtually all of them tedious. And the Dowager was laughing. Not politely, genuinely. The specific laugh of someone encountering something they did not expect and find genuinely delightful. Lord Pemberton, the cabinet minister whose presence at the reception Vivienne had arranged with considerable effort over 3 months of social management, had detached himself from the conversation she had positioned him in and was making his way toward the garden doors, toward Clara. Her husband of 3 hours was looking across the room from the far end of the dining table with the expression of a man who has noticed something and is about to remark on it. Vivienne's smile did not falter. She was very good at smiling, but something behind it shifted. A fractional internal rearrangement of the landscape of the afternoon, the specific sensation of a plan that was constructed carefully and is now producing results in exactly the wrong direction with the particular momentum of something that cannot be reversed. Before we understand what Clara Fenwick arrived at this wedding carrying, what 7 years in Edinburgh had made of her, and how thoroughly a plan designed for humiliation became the occasion of something entirely different. Subscribe to the Time Secrets and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. If you believe Clara deserved every moment of that afternoon, comment justice below. Now let us return to where this story began, to the woman Clara was, to the household that tried to diminish her, and to what becomes of people who cannot be diminished because they do not get their worth from the people doing the diminishing. Clara Fenwick had grown up in a household built around books, careful observation, and the specific warmth of a man who found the world genuinely fascinating and communicated this to his daughter as simply the natural condition of a thoughtful life. Mr. Aldous Fenwick was a scholar of modest professional standing and immodest intellectual range, a man who had published 2 small books on classical translation that were read appreciatively by the 40 or 50 people in England who cared about classical translation and who had spent his working life teaching at a small academy in Somerset while pursuing his own reading and writing with the quietly devoted consistency of someone who understands that the life of the mind does not require an audience to be worth living. He was also simply a good father. He talked to Clara from the age she could reliably hold a conversation as though what she thought was genuinely interesting, which it was, because she had inherited his particular quality, the specific warmth of someone who finds other people and other ideas more interesting than themselves, which is rarer than it sounds, and more attractive in practice than any amount of deliberate social performance. Clara asked questions, real ones. She asked them of everyone, her father's students who came for tutorials, the cook who had opinions about spice markets, the visiting scholar who came for a week and stayed a month because no one at the academy engaged with his work as directly as the schoolmaster's daughter. She asked because she actually wanted to know, and people could tell the difference, and the difference was what made the conversations worth having. She was 16 when her father died. It happened in November, quietly, in the way that gentle people sometimes leave, without adequate warning and without the dramatic resolution that would have made the grief easier to process. He had been ill for 3 weeks with something that presented as a chest complaint and revealed itself as more serious, too late for anything useful to be done. Clara managed the first months with the focused composure that grief sometimes produces in people who have been trained by a steady parent to approach difficult things directly. She managed the household. She managed the academy's immediate administrative aftermath. She managed also her own grief, not by suppressing it, but by allowing it completely in private, and then returning to what required doing, because her father had taught her that things requiring doing were not less important because something painful had happened. What she could not manage was what her father's death introduced into the household. Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, her stepmother, and Miss Vivienne Fenwick, her stepsister, 3 years older and already in full command of the social management skills she would deploy with increasing sophistication across the following decade, had arrived in the Fenwick household 2 years before Aldous' death, when he had married Dorothea in the specific hope of companionship that a widower of his temperament required, and the specific error of not quite seeing clearly enough that his new wife and stepdaughter valued things he had never particularly valued himself. They had tolerated the household's atmosphere while Aldous was alive because he was its center, and his presence organized everything around his particular quality. After his death, with that quality absent, what remained was a household whose resources were insufficient for 2 women who required more than it could provide, and 1 girl whose presence was a daily reminder of resources that might otherwise have been directed elsewhere. Clara was not dramatic about any of this. She had not been raised for drama. She was, however, paying careful attention, as she always had been, as her father had made inevitable in her. And she understood, with the complete accuracy of someone who has learned to read situations carefully, precisely what she was in the Fenwick household in the years after her father's death. She was a problem to be managed. Vivienne managed her with the specific expertise of someone who had identified both the target and the method early, and applied the method consistently across 3 years without ever producing anything that could be directly cited as cruelty. She was not physically unkind. She was socially precise. The small expert exclusions that leave no obvious evidence of intention. The gathering that Clara was not told about until afterward. The introduction at a county occasion that was performed with enough warmth to be unreproachable and enough condescension to communicate everything that mattered. The comment delivered in company that was technically a compliment and functionally the opposite. The steady, consistent message, never stated, always present, that Clara's position in the household was a courtesy rather than a right, and that her enthusiasms and her questions and her genuine interest in everything were charming, perhaps, in a girl of limited prospects, but were not the qualities that produced a life of consequence. Clara received all of this with the composure that was simply her manner. Not because she did not feel it. She felt it with the specific accuracy of someone who notices things precisely. Which meant she noticed Vivienne's technique the same way she noticed everything else, clearly and in full. But she had been raised by a man who found the world genuinely fascinating, and the world had not stopped being genuinely fascinating simply because the household she was living in had decided she was not. She read. She corresponded, maintaining, quietly and without advertising it, the network of scholarly connections her father had built, and that she had been corresponding within for years alongside him. She found the cook's opinions about spice markets as interesting at 18 as they had been at 12. Vivienne had never quite understood that you cannot diminish someone who does not look to you for their worth. It remained the central error of her calculation. The Fenwick household in the 3 years between Aldous' death and Dorothea's decline into ill health was a complicated place to inhabit if you were Clara. Not dramatically, not obviously enough to generate sympathy from anyone outside it, but in the specific way of somewhere that has decided, without announcing it, that your presence is provisional. Dorothea was not a malicious woman. She was, by the assessment Clara made with the fairness she brought to everything, a woman whose own anxiety about position and resources had been managed throughout her first marriage and was now entirely unmanaged, and who had resolved this by transferring the anxiety's weight onto the household member least positioned to resist it. She did not do this consciously. That was the thing that Clara found, across 3 years of careful observation, the most accurate account of Dorothea. Not deliberate cruelty, but the unconscious cruelty of someone whose own fear has become the household's organizing principle, and who has not examined this closely enough to correct it. Vivienne had no such excuse. Vivienne was deliberate in everything she did. It was her primary characteristic, and Clara had always found it, before she fully understood what it was applied to, almost admirable. The specific efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and identifies the most direct route to it, with the focused capability of a natural strategist. The strategy that was applied to Clara across 3 years was elegant in its simplicity. Ensure that Clara was consistently positioned as the lesser version of everything being compared, and do so through social framing, subtle enough to maintain plausible warmth while producing the desired effect in anyone watching. The effect Vivienne desired was not precisely Clara's suffering. It was the confirmation of her own position by contrast, the specific reassurance of someone who needs the hierarchy to be visible rather than simply present. Clara understood this at 17, which was perhaps earlier than Vivienne had expected, and certainly earlier than she would have preferred. Understanding it did not particularly change Clara's behavior, because her behavior had never been organized around Vivienne's approval or disapproval. She continued reading, corresponding, asking questions, finding the world interesting. She helped in the household where it was needed and managed the practical running of it with the same focused capability her father had used it as evidence of when she was 12. The 3 years were not happy. They were not unhappy in the consuming way of something that takes over everything. They were simply what they were, a period of insufficient light that Clara inhabited without being destroyed by it, because she had enough internal resources to sustain herself in the absence of external ones. Dorothea's health failed in Clara's 19th year. She died in February, leaving behind a modest estate that was divided according to her will, with the specific unfairness of a document that had been drafted under Vivienne's careful supervision, and that reflected Vivienne's priorities with complete accuracy. Clara received a small sum, enough with careful management to make a beginning. She made a beginning. She wrote to her father's cousin in Edinburgh on the day after the will was read. Professor Robert Fenwick held a chair in classical languages at the University of Edinburgh and had maintained an occasional correspondence with Aldous across 30 years of mutual scholarly interest and the specific bond of two people who find the same things important and do not see each other often enough. He had written to Clara after her father's death with the genuine warmth of a man who had always liked Aldous and who understood from the letter he received in return. Careful, precise, the product of someone who had thought seriously about what they were writing, that Aldous's daughter was not merely being polite in maintaining the connection. He had suggested in a letter the previous autumn that if she were ever inclined to visit Edinburgh, his household would be genuinely glad of her company. She wrote to remind him of the offer. He wrote back within a fortnight. "Come whenever you are ready," he said. "We have a spare room and more books than we know what to do with. Both are yours for as long as they are useful." She arrived in Edinburgh in March with one trunk, her father's complete correspondence files, and the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for adequate material for several years and has just found it. The Fenwick household in Edinburgh was everything the Fenwick household in Somerset had not been since her father died. It was full, not of people performing sociality, but of people genuinely engaged with things they found important. The professor and his wife, both scholars in their own right. Two doctoral students who lived in the upper rooms and left books on every available surface. A weekly gathering on Thursday evenings that drew, depending on the week, physicians, writers, visiting academics, and the occasional politician interested in education reform. Clara attended the first Thursday evening 2 weeks after her arrival, sitting quietly near the edge of the conversation with the composed attention she brought to any situation she was still assessing. By the third Thursday, she was no longer at the edge. Not because she had positioned herself at the center. She had done nothing of the kind. Because the quality she had always had, in a room of people who valued that quality, operated exactly as it always had. She found things interesting. She asked real questions. She listened to the answers with the complete attention that made people feel in her company that what they were saying was worth saying. And then she responded with the honesty that made the conversation worth having. The professor watched this across the first month with the satisfaction of someone whose initial assessment is being confirmed beyond what they had anticipated. "She is her father's daughter," he told his wife after the fourth Thursday. "She is more than that," his wife said, with the directness of a woman who has been observing Clara for 4 weeks and has formed specific opinions. The translation work began by accident, as the best professional identities sometimes do. A visiting German scholar attending a Thursday evening in April had brought with him a text he was attempting to make accessible to English readers, and was frustrated with every existing translation's tendency to sacrifice clarity for elegance. He had been describing this frustration to the professor when Clara, who had been listening with the focused attention she brought to problems that interested her, said that the passage he had just quoted in English was not translating the German's primary grammatical emphasis correctly, and that the meaning shifted significantly as a result. The visiting scholar looked at her. She told him what the original said and what the English ought to say. He read the passage she indicated. He looked at her again. "You read German," he said. "Yes," she said. "My father had a significant German philosophical library and limited funds for translation services." The scholar took out a card. He asked if she would be willing to look at the first 3 chapters of his text. She looked at the first 3 chapters. She returned them in a fortnight with corrections, clarifications, and a covering note that explained the reasoning behind each change with the specific pedagogical thoroughness of someone who has been explaining things to people her whole life and finds it natural. The scholar showed the corrected chapters to 2 colleagues. Both colleagues wrote to her. Within a year, she had a professional identity that she had not planned and had arrived at entirely by being exactly herself in a room where being exactly herself turned out to be precisely what was required. The years in Edinburgh accumulated with the productive quality of time well spent, each year building on the previous, the translation reputation growing as the scholarly network expanded, publications appearing under her name in academic journals, with the quiet regularity of good work being done by someone who finds the work itself the sufficient motivation. She was not wealthy. Her income was modest by any measure that Vivienne would have applied. She lived simply. The house was small, the furniture adequate. The social occasions she attended were academic rather than fashionable. She was also, by every measure that her father had taught her to apply, exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about Vivienne occasionally, not with bitterness, which she had decided was inefficient, but with the curious clinical interest she brought to anything she did not fully understand. She did not understand Vivienne's need to confirm her position by diminishing others. She found it genuinely puzzling in the way that she found any human behavior puzzling when it appeared to produce suffering rather than the thing the person actually wanted. She was 26 years old, 7 years removed from the Fenwick household when the wedding invitation arrived. She read it twice. She understood immediately and completely what it was. She put it on her desk. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she wrote to accept. Miss Vivienne Fenwick had become Lady Hartwell through the application of the same strategic intelligence she applied to everything, identifying what she wanted, identifying the most direct route to it, and executing the route with the thoroughness that had always been her greatest practical asset. Lord Henry Hartwell was everything she had correctly assessed him to be: a Somerset landowner of genuine substance, intellectually engaged without being impractical, socially well-connected without being consumed by it, and possessed of a warmth that she found, if she was honest with herself in the private way she occasionally permitted, genuinely attractive rather than merely useful. She was not performing everything about the marriage. This was a distinction she rarely made explicit, even to herself. She had performed the courtship with the specific excellence she brought to everything strategic, and somewhere inside the performance, she had found something she had not entirely planned for. Whether this would develop into something she could trust was a question she had not yet answered, because trusting things had never been the skill she most reliably possessed. The wedding was, externally, the most successful occasion she had organized. The single element she had introduced that was not visible in the external record. The invitation to Clara, the specific positioning of that invitation within the guest list, the mental architecture of what the afternoon was supposed to produce, was the private satisfaction she had been building toward for 6 months. She had researched Clara carefully. She had found what she expected to find: a woman living modestly in Edinburgh, working in an academic field, unmarried, without the social position or material circumstance that this occasion was designed to make visible. She had found also that Clara had published some papers in academic journals that Vivienne had located but not read, translated texts under her name, correspondence cited in other publications, and had noted this as evidence that the academic work was real rather than merely claimed, which was, if anything, more useful to the plan. A woman who had built a real life from modest materials was, at a Somerset wedding reception of this quality, still going to look like exactly what she was. Or so Vivienne had calculated. She had made, in this calculation, 3 errors. The first was her assumption that the quality of a room is measured by its external appearance, rather than by the actual capability of the people in it to recognize genuine worth when it presents itself. The second was her failure to account for the Dowager Lady Hartwell, who had attended 200 social occasions and found virtually all of them tedious, and who was therefore not operating by the social assumptions Vivienne's plan depended on. The third and most significant was her failure, across 7 years of absence, to update her model of Clara, to consider that the woman she was inviting was not the 19-year-old who had left Somerset with 1 trunk and a small inheritance, but the person that 7 years of Edinburgh and genuine work and the specific growth that happens to people who are in the right environment had made of her. She had been planning for the person Clara had been. Clara arrived as the person she had become. Clara arrived at Hartwell Hall on the afternoon of the wedding in a gray dress. It was an excellent gray dress. The the specific gray of a woman who has spent 7 years around people who care about quality and nothing about display, and has arrived at the understanding that these are not the same thing. It was well cut and well made, and entirely without decoration, and it suited her in the specific way that clothes suit people who wear them without thinking about being seen in them. She arrived, knowing approximately what Vivienne intended. She had always been able to read Vivienne with the accuracy of someone who has been its subject for 3 years and has paid careful attention throughout. The invitation's specific warmth, the particular phrasing about family, the timing, 6 months before the occasion, as though the relationship between them warranted that level of planning, told her enough to form a reasonable hypothesis about the afternoon's intended shape. She attended anyway. Not to confront, not to perform, not to produce any particular result. She attended because she had thought about it for 3 days and had decided that the world was still more interesting than the alternative of not engaging with it, and because there was, beneath everything, a genuine and somewhat regretful curiosity about Vivienne, about what she had built, about who she had become, about whether 7 years had changed anything between them. She arrived and found the occasion was exactly as excellent as she had expected it to be. Vivienne's taste was never in question, and found a corner near the garden doors where she could observe the room without requiring anything from it. The Dowager Lady Hartwell found her within 20 minutes. The Dowager was 87 years old and moved with the specific authority of someone who has long since stopped caring about anything except what she actually finds interesting. She had been surveying the reception from her chair near the fireplace with the comprehensive assessment of someone who has attended 200 of these and has developed a reliable system for identifying the 1 or 2 people at any given occasion who are worth speaking to. She had identified Clara. She crossed the room with the directness of her age and her position, and arrived beside her with no preamble. "You are not on the seating plan," the Dowager said. "I am a late addition," Clara said. "Clara Fenwick, the bride's stepsister." "What do you do?" the Dowager said. She asked it with the directness of a woman who considers what people do the most reliable indicator of what they are. "I translate German philosophy into English," Clara said. The Dowager looked at her for a moment. "Which texts?" she said. Clara named several. The Dowager's expression changed. It was not a large change. She had too much practice at composure for that. But it was a real one. "I have been looking for a satisfactory English rendering of a specific Schopenhauer passage for 6 years," she said. "Every available translation loses something essential in the movement between the 3rd and 4th clauses." "Which passage?" Clara said. The Dowager quoted it from memory. Clara considered for a moment. "The difficulty is that the German holds 2 meanings simultaneously, that English requires a choice between," she said. "Most translators choose elegance. The passage actually requires the more awkward option, because the awkwardness is doing philosophical work." The Dowager was quiet for 2 seconds. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chairs beside the garden doors. "I am already standing," Clara pointed out. "Then stay there," the Dowager said, and sat down herself and looked up at Clara with the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for and does not intend to be separated from it for the foreseeable future. Vivienne, positioned near the east fireplace with a champagne glass she had not drunk from, watched the Dowager take Clara's arm 15 minutes later when they moved toward the dining room and felt the first genuine misgiving of the afternoon arrive. Lord Pemberton arrived at the dining room table 12 minutes into the meal. He had been seated at the far end, which was correct for his position in the seating plan that Vivienne had constructed with considerable care. He was not at the far end of the table. He was making his way toward the garden end, where the Dowager was seated with Clara, with the focused movement of a man who has heard something in passing that has activated his professional attention. He had been near enough to overhear a fragment of the Dowager and Clara's conversation as they moved through the dining room. Something about the relationship between philosophical translation and educational policy that had contained a specific observation about German pedagogical texts and their English reception that had made him stop walking for a moment before resuming with increased direction. He sat beside Clara. He introduced himself, and she looked at him with the warm directness that was simply her manner and introduced herself. He asked what she was working on currently. She told him. He asked a follow-up question that was genuinely engaged rather than socially obligatory. She answered it. The dinner continued. Vivienne, seated at the head of the table as was correct for the bride, watched Lord Pemberton lean forward across the table to Clara with the expression of a man discovering something he has been looking for, and felt the second misgiving arrive with more force than the first. The groom's Oxford colleague, a man named Dr. Whitmore, who had been corresponding with a translator in Edinburgh for 6 months about a joint publication project, was seated 3 places from Clara on the same side of the table and had been trying to work out, since the beginning of the first course, why something about her name was familiar. He worked it out between the second and third courses. He leaned toward her. "Are you the Fenwick who has been corresponding with James Alderton about the Kant project?" he said. Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. Dr. Whitmore put down his fork. "I have been trying to meet you for 6 months," he said with the specific fervor of a man who has been waiting for a professional encounter that has arrived unexpectedly in a social context. "James has been telling everyone who will listen that you have completely changed how he understands the secondary literature." The conversation between them continued through the remaining courses. Vivienne ate her wedding dinner. She ate it with composure. She smiled at her husband, who sat beside her as was correct, and she responded to the toasts, and she accepted the congratulations of the guests who approached her at their places in the meal. And she did all of this with the smooth social proficiency that had always been her greatest practical strength. She also watched from the controlled peripheral attention of someone tracking a situation while appearing not to, as the afternoon she had spent 6 months designing became something she had not designed. The guests near Clara's end of the table were leaning forward. The Dowager had not released her arm. Lord Pemberton was making notes on the card he kept for professional observations. Dr. Whitmore was explaining to the man beside him who Clara was and why this mattered with the animated brevity of someone who has discovered an important thing and cannot quite contain his enthusiasm for it. And Lord Henry Hartwell, her husband of 4 hours, the man whose wedding this was, the man she had organized every element of this afternoon to impress, looked down the table and said, in the quiet aside he directed to his cousin seated at his right, the 6 words that arrived in Vivienne's peripheral attention like a stone through glass. "Who is that? She is extraordinary." Vivienne set down her champagne glass. She had been carrying it for nearly 2 hours. She had not drunk from it once. She held the smile through the remainder of the reception. She held it through the clearing of the dining tables and the music that followed, and the general movement of guests from dinner formality to the more relaxed sociality of the later afternoon. She held it through the conversations directed at her. The congratulations, the compliments on the flowers and the food, the warmth of guests who were genuinely happy to be there. She held it with the skill of a woman who has been managing social performance since she was 12 years old and has developed the specific capability of maintaining the surface while the interior produces a completely different account of events. Internally, she was cataloging. The Dowager. She had not anticipated the Dowager. She had seated the Dowager near the garden doors because the Dowager preferred rooms she could exit easily and had placed Clara near the garden doors for the symmetrically opposite reason that the garden doors were a polite distance from the occasion's center. She had not considered that these 2 placements would bring the most formidable person in the room into immediate proximity with the person she had intended to be peripheral. Lord Pemberton, She had managed Lord Pemberton's attendance with considerable effort over 3 months. She had positioned him at the far end of the table from Clara. His migration toward Clara mid-meal was not something she had planned for, because it had not occurred to her that the cabinet minister she had acquired for this occasion would find a translator of German philosophy more professionally relevant than the conversations she had arranged for him. Dr. Whitmore? She had known he was coming. She had not known he had been corresponding with Clara. She had not known this because it had not occurred to her to research the professional connections of her own husband's Oxford friends against the professional activities of her stepsister, because in Vivienne's model of the afternoon, those two categories did not intersect. Henry, this was the one she sat with the longest. Henry was not a man who said things carelessly. She had understood this about him from their first extended conversation, which was one of the reasons she had assessed him as worth pursuing. He said what he meant and meant what he said, and when he said that the woman at the end of his wedding table was extraordinary, he meant it in the full sense of the word. She had spent 6 months ensuring that the occasion of her marriage was the most impressive thing in Henry's environment on this particular day. She had imported for that purpose the specific contrast she needed. The contrast had not behaved as contrasts were supposed to behave. Clara had not been peripheral. She had been, from within 20 minutes of her arrival, the person that the Dowager and the cabinet minister and her husband's oldest friend, and, eventually, her husband himself, had found most worth attending to. Not because Clara had done anything to produce this result, because she was the person she had always been, in a room of people capable of recognizing it. The sun was beginning to descend toward the estate gardens when Vivienne found Clara near the herbaceous border, standing, looking at a late flowering clematis with the focused botanical interest of someone who finds plants interesting and is in the presence of an interesting one. She had not planned this conversation. She was not sure afterward why she had initiated it. "I am glad you came," she said. The words arrived before she had decided whether they were true. She waited to see if they were. They were, she found, more true than she had expected. Clara turned from the clematis. She looked at Vivienne with the warm, direct gray eyes that had always seen the complete thing. "Are you?" she said, not unkindly, simply asking. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I intended," she began, and then stopped because the sentence had several possible continuations, and none of them were ones she could complete without saying something true, and saying true things had not been the mode of this afternoon. "I know what you intended," Clara said. She said it without heat, simply as a fact they both held. Vivienne looked at her. "And you came anyway," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "Why?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the clematis briefly, and then at Vivienne again. "Because you are the only person still alive who knew my father when he was alive," she said. "And that is worth something to me, regardless of what else is true between us." The garden was entirely quiet, except for the distant sound of guests on the terrace above them. "I also thought," Clara said with the honesty that had always been her manner, and that Vivienne had always found, beneath her management of it, slightly disarming, that perhaps 7 years had changed things enough that something more genuine was possible. Between us? I was not certain. I thought it was worth finding out. Vivienne stood in her own wedding garden on the evening of her wedding day and received this. She received it with the specific discomfort of someone encountering honesty they have not prepared for, in a form that is more generous than they have given any reason to expect from a person they invited for reasons that now required significant revision. She did not know what to do with any of it. This was, she understood, a very unusual experience. "Clara," she said. "Yes," Clara said. She wanted to say something adequate to the moment. She did not have it available. She had spent 30 years assembling a vocabulary for social management and had not, apparently, spent equivalent time developing a vocabulary for anything else. Clara, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who has always been willing to wait for people to find their way to honesty, said nothing. "I am not," Vivienne began and stopped again. "You don't have to say it tonight," Clara said. "It is your wedding day. It is not a day for difficult conversations." She said it warmly, entirely without irony. Vivienne looked at her stepsister, the woman she had invited to be diminished, who had arrived and been exactly herself, and had produced from the simple fact of being herself an afternoon that Vivienne would be organizing and reorganizing in her memory for weeks. "Good night, Vivienne," Clara said. She meant it warmly. That was the thing Vivienne kept returning to afterward. Clara meant everything she said, including the good night, including the part about their father, including the part about something more genuine being possible. She had not said any of it as performance. She had said it because it was true, and she was in the habit of saying true things. She left the garden. Vivienne stood in the herbaceous border for several minutes after she had gone, in the quiet of her own estate on the evening of her own wedding, with the conversation she had not planned for, and the afternoon she had not planned, sitting beside each other in her internal accounting and refusing to be organized into something more manageable. The weeks after the wedding moved with the specific quality of weeks, following an occasion that has produced more than it was supposed to. Vivienne managed the transition into her married life with the competence she brought to everything: the settling into Hartwell Hall, the domestic arrangements, the social calendar that a woman of her new position was expected to maintain. She managed it well, as she managed everything well. Henry mentioned Clara 3 times in the first fortnight, not with any particular emphasis, simply in the natural way of a man who had found someone interesting at an occasion, and whose mind returned to interesting things with the ease of someone who values them. He mentioned the Dowager's assessment. She had apparently told him, with characteristic directness, that Clara was the most worth talking to person at his wedding, excepting possibly himself. He mentioned Lord Pemberton's letter. The cabinet minister had written, following the wedding, to say that the conversation with Clara had given him a perspective on the education reform question he had been considering for months, and that he intended to be in touch with her. He mentioned once that Dr. Whitmore's joint publication project with the Edinburgh translator had apparently been confirmed, and that he hoped to meet her again at some point. Vivienne said yes. She said it with the composure she had always had, and that was now, she noticed with the internal honesty, she had started permitting herself in slightly larger quantities since the garden conversation, doing different work than before. Less certainty in it, more awareness of what it was managing. She received a letter from the Dowager in November, a brief characteristic note informing her that she had located Clara's published translations and found the Schopenhauer rendering when she finally received it, precisely as satisfying as the conversation at the wedding had led her to anticipate, and that she intended to write to Clara directly. And did Vivienne have an address? Vivienne provided the address. She held the pen for a moment after writing it. She thought about the garden, about Clara looking at the clematis, about "You are the only person still alive who knew my father when he was alive." She thought about her own father, briefly, a man she had barely known, who had not been important to her in the ways that mattered, who had not left her with the specific inheritance that Aldous Fenwick had left Clara. She thought about the household she had grown up in, and the household she had arrived at when her mother married Aldous, and about what she had done with 3 years inside that household, and why she had done it. She did not arrive in this thinking at comfortable conclusions. She arrived at accurate ones, which was different and more useful, though considerably less comfortable. She was 33 years old, and she had spent 20 years being very good at knowing what she wanted and very efficient at obtaining it, and had not spent equivalent time examining whether what she wanted was the right thing to want. This was, she understood, with the specific discomfort of genuine self-knowledge, a significant gap. Clara's letter arrived in December. Short, warm, entirely without reference to the wedding or to anything that had happened before it. She mentioned a text she was working on. A longer project, the most ambitious translation she had attempted. A philosophical text that had not yet been rendered in English and that she found genuinely exciting. She asked after Vivienne's health and Henry's. She mentioned the Dowager with genuine warmth. They had apparently begun a correspondence that Clara described as the most unexpected and enjoyable of her recent professional connections. She said she would be glad to correspond if Vivienne wished to. Vivienne read the letter at her desk in the Hartwell Hall morning room on a gray December afternoon while Henry worked in the adjacent study and the fire burned with the steady warmth of a house that was, she had begun to allow herself to notice, genuinely good to be in. She read it once. She read it again. She set it beside the inkwell. She thought about it for a long time. Then she picked up her pen. She did not know, as she set the nib to the paper, exactly what she would write. She knew that whatever she wrote would be different from what she would have written 6 months ago. Before the wedding, before the garden, before the afternoon that had produced everything except what she had planned it to. She knew it would be more honest. She knew also that honest was harder and more expensive and more necessary than efficient, and that this was something her stepsister had understood since childhood, and that she was only now, at 33, beginning to learn properly. The fire burned. The pen moved. Outside, the morning room windows, the December light was failing over the Hartwell gardens. The herbaceous border quiet and dormant. The late flowering clematis stripped back to its winter structure. The estate folded into itself against the cold. In Edinburgh, in a small house full of books, Clara Fenwick was at her own desk, with her own pen and the ambitious text that she found genuinely exciting, and the correspondence that connected her to the professor and the minister and the Dowager and the Oxford colleague and the growing network of people who had found, by the natural operation of quality being recognized, that she was worth knowing. She was not waiting for anything. She was simply working, which was what she had always done, which was what had always been sufficient. And in Somerset, in the morning room of Hartwell Hall, Vivienne Hartwell wrote something true for the first time in a very long time. She did not know yet whether it would be enough. She understood for the first time that enough was not hers to determine. It was Clara's, and that was exactly as it should be.